On the night of December 25th, 1991, the red flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, the largest country the world had ever seen, simply ceased to exist. But the most dangerous thing it ever built did not vanish with it. Scattered across a collapsing empire, spread over 11 time zones, sat close to 30,000 nuclear weapons. And overnight, they no longer belonged to a superpower. They belonged to 4 separate countries, 3 of which had barely existed the day before. This is the story of what happened to the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons after it fell. When the Soviet flag was lowered, its arsenal did not sit neatly inside Russia. For decades, Soviet commanders had spread their weapons across the Union, and when the borders were suddenly redrawn, the bombs stayed where they were. Russia held the largest share, but 3 other new nations woke up with nuclear weapons on their soil: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Ukraine's inheritance was staggering. Around 1,700 strategic warheads sat on its territory, mounted on missiles that had once been aimed at the United States, along with thousands of smaller tactical weapons. In an instant, Ukraine had become the 3rd largest nuclear power on the planet, holding more warheads than Britain, France, and China combined. Kazakhstan held roughly 1,400 strategic warheads, along with the vast testing grounds at Semipalatinsk, where the Soviets had detonated hundreds of bombs. Belarus held 81 mobile missiles, each one built to move at a moment's notice. The world watched with something close to panic. For 50 years there had been 2 hands on the Soviet trigger, and now there might be 4. Worse still were the smaller weapons. The Soviet Union had built tens of thousands of tactical warheads, some of them small enough to fit inside a duffel bag. In a country sliding into chaos, where soldiers went months without pay and almost everything seemed to be for sale, the fear was simple and terrifying. What if one of them went missing? The first task was not to destroy the arsenal. It was to get the most portable pieces home before anyone else could reach them. That effort began almost immediately. Through 1992, Russia quietly pulled its tactical nuclear weapons back from the other republics, loading them onto trains and moving them behind Russian borders. By the middle of that year, the smallest and most vulnerable weapons were largely accounted for. The strategic warheads were a harder problem. In May 1992, the 4 nuclear successor states sat down with the United States and signed the Lisbon Protocol. Under it, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus agreed to give up every nuclear weapon on their territory and hand it to Russia, and to sign the global treaty that would bind them as nations without the bomb. On paper, the problem was solved. In practice, one country was having second thoughts. Ukraine looked at the weapons on its soil and saw the only thing standing between it and a much larger, resentful neighbour. Some in Kiev argued that giving up the arsenal would leave the country defenceless. For nearly 2 years, Ukraine hesitated, and the world held its breath. The deadlock broke in December 1994. In the city of Budapest, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and Britain signed a memorandum of security assurances. Ukraine would surrender its nuclear weapons. In return, Russia, America, and Britain promised to respect its borders and its independence, and never to threaten it with force. It was a trade of steel for a signature, a real arsenal for a written promise. With the deal done, the warheads began to move. One by one, the missiles were pulled from their silos, and the warheads were loaded and shipped east into Russia. Kazakhstan handed over its last strategic weapon in the spring of 1995. Ukraine transferred its final warhead in the summer of 1996. Belarus followed that November. Kazakhstan went further and shut down the Semipalatinsk test site for good, closing a place that had poisoned its own land for 4 decades. In less than 5 years, 3 of the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth had been dismantled without a single shot. But the warheads were only part of the danger. Somewhere in Kazakhstan, in a lightly guarded warehouse, sat a secret the Soviets had almost forgotten. In the autumn of 1993, an American diplomat in Kazakhstan received a quiet tip. In a metallurgical plant in the eastern city of Ust-Kamenogorsk, there was a stockpile of uranium. Not just any uranium. This was around 600 kilograms of highly enriched weapons-grade material, purer than 90%, left over from a Soviet nuclear submarine program that had been cancelled years earlier. Moscow appeared to have simply lost track of it. It sat in ordinary barrels behind an ordinary fence, enough material to build roughly 20 nuclear bombs, and people were looking for it. Agents from Iran were reported to be moving through Central Asia, hunting for exactly this kind of material. If it reached the black market, there would be no getting it back. The United States decided to act, and to act in total secrecy. The operation was called Project Sapphire. In October 1994, a team of 31 American technicians flew into Kazakhstan. For weeks, working long shifts in bitter cold, they repackaged the uranium into hundreds of steel containers built to survive a crash. Then, on a freezing November night, the material was driven to a local airport over roads slick with black ice, every mile carrying the risk that a truck might slide off into a river. Waiting on the runway were 3 of the largest aircraft in the American fleet, C-5 Galaxy transports. They flew the cargo non-stop, refueling in mid-air, all the way to Delaware, and from there armoured trucks carried it to a secure government complex at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Only after it was locked away did the American government tell the world what it had done. More than half a ton of bomb-grade uranium had been quietly flown out of the former Soviet Union and put beyond anyone's reach. Project Sapphire was one piece of a much larger effort. Back in 1991, 2 American senators, Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, had pushed through a program to spend American money securing and dismantling the crumbling Soviet arsenal. In the years that followed, it would help deactivate thousands of warheads and lock down countless tons of dangerous material across the former Union. But the most remarkable fate of all belonged to the uranium inside the warheads themselves. In 1993, Russia and the United States struck a deal that sounded almost impossible. Russia would take the highly enriched uranium out of its dismantled weapons, blend it down until it could no longer make a bomb, and sell it to America as fuel for civilian power plants. The program was called Megatons to Megawatts. Over the next 20 years, the uranium from around 20,000 Soviet warheads was converted and shipped across the ocean. 500 metric tons of the most feared material on Earth was loaded into the reactors of American power stations. And there it did something no one in the Cold War could have imagined. For 2 decades, as much as 1/10 of all the electricity used in the United States came from fuel that had once sat inside Soviet nuclear weapons. The bombs that had been built to destroy American cities ended up lighting American homes. When the final shipment arrived in 2013, 20,000 warheads worth of uranium had been erased from existence, turned from a weapon into a current running quietly through millions of houses. By then, the transformation was almost complete. Of the 15 countries that emerged from the Soviet Union, 14 were entirely free of nuclear weapons. Every warhead left behind in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus had been returned to Russia, dismantled, or converted into fuel. And in all the years since the collapse, not one Soviet nuclear weapon has ever been found outside Russian hands, a fact that once seemed almost too much to hope for. And yet the story did not end cleanly. The promises made in Budapest, the guarantees that persuaded Ukraine to give up the 3rd largest arsenal on Earth, would be tested in the harshest way. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea. In 2022, it launched a full-scale invasion of the very country it had once promised to protect. The security assurances that had traded Ukraine's weapons for words did not hold. And a difficult question has haunted the region ever since. Did Ukraine give away the only shield it ever had? The Soviet Union's nuclear weapons did not disappear when the country did. They were counted, argued over, smuggled away in secret, and finally taken apart. Some were flown out in the dead of night. Some were blended into the fuel that now powers a rival nation. and a few live on only as a lesson. A reminder that when an empire falls, the most dangerous things it leaves behind do not simply vanish. Someone has to decide where they go. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this one, you will want to see what happened to the men who guarded those secrets. Subscribe and hit the bell for more from Cold War Classified.